I get asked a seemingly simple question quite often, and it rivals what came first, the chicken or the egg. The debates on this question can get pretty interesting. That question is simply, should I crimp or should I solder? My quick answer is almost always going to be to crimp. There are pros and cons associated with each, and I'm going to cover some of the highlights that are associated with them. Any connection should start with quality components and the correct tools for the job, starting with your wire strippers. Stripping wire with your pocket knife, pair of side cutters, or the wrong gauge slot in your stripping tool can cause breaks in the conductor that can result in excessive resistance, as well as frayed conductors that can cause failure over time. Let's start with crimped connections. Crimped electrical connections have been around since they were introduced in the early 40s. Over the years, technology as well as materials have improved since the early days. Most people think that a crimped connection just crushes the contact in the wire, as you can see in this cross section of a poorly executed crimp connection. In reality, when done properly, as you can see in this cross-section crimp, the pressure involved causes the metals to flow, resulting in the welding of the metal surfaces that will produce a gas-tight as well as a connection with minimal resistance that will not allow oxidation to occur over time. It's a good idea to pull test your connections once you've made them. You shouldn't be able to pull the wire out when applying a reasonable amount of force to that connector. In most cases, if stressed to its failure point, the wire should actually break before coming out of the connector. Over-crimp connections are just as bad as under-crimp connections, as it will work hard in the connection, making it brittle and prone to failure. In short, proper crimp connections create a weld between the connector and the wire, creating an environmentally resistant, long-lasting connection without creating a brittle, failure-prone joint. The key to proper crimp connections are simple. Use high-quality materials that are designed to work together, utilizing quality connectors, the proper gauge wire, and assembling them with the proper crimping tools and techniques. In front of us, you see a broad assortment of crimping tools. What you're going to find that you do not want to use, that are not acceptable, is going to be a hammer, channel locks, lineman pliers, things like side cutters. You want to make sure you use the proper crimping tools every time. There's several crimping tools available on the market. They can range from the basic, essentially a hardware store type of crimping tool, which I really don't recommend, to professional quality crimpers. They can range anywhere from a standard compound leverage manual crimper all the way up to some high-end hydraulic crimpers. The key is, again, to use the proper crimping tools. If you're crimping ECU pins for Holley EFI, it's going to be important to make sure that you use the correct crimpers. Holley part number 567-100 is the crimper that's available for that. We also have a crimping tool that has interchangeable anvils that's available through MSD to cover a lot of your other crimping needs. And the key is making sure that you're using the proper connectors. When it comes to applications with sub-harnesses that require you to disconnect and reconnect your connections, I like to use commonly available WeatherPack as well as MetroPack connectors for those applications. Again, one of the keys to that is making sure that when you make those connections and you're crimping the terminals, that you use the proper crimping tools that are designed for the job. When it comes to eyelets, spades, and butt connectors, I personally like the non-insulated type. When you're buying these connectors, you want to go for a good quality connector, preferably that is either a seamless or a brazed seam type of connector. Once you get done crimping these connectors, it's important to make sure that you put a little bit of shrink wrap over it, and I prefer the adhesive lined shrink tube. One of the keys to properly crimping these type of connectors is to look at the connector and the orientation, look for the seam, and you always want to do what they call saddle the seam, in which case you make sure that your detent on the crimping tools is properly aligned opposite the seam. Once it's properly crimped with your connections, one of the things you're going to find is that it should give you a good, solid, secure joint that can take actually quite a bit of abuse in order to separate. So people that think that crimped joints are not a secure, solid joint probably haven't been doing it properly. One of the keys to that, again, is making sure that you use the right crimping tools. Generally, I will use this pair of Thomas & Betts crimping tools or this ratcheting style crimper. Either way, just make sure that you're using the proper crimping tool and you're crimping it in the proper place to provide the required bell mouth for the correct strain relief. A few companies offer a nice selection of quality crimp connections that have the adhesive line shrink tube built into those already. These connectors are pretty nice, and I always keep a few of those in my wheelhouse. But I usually prefer to shrink non-insulated connections because it allows you to visually inspect your connector a little bit easier. Holley offers connector kits for popular engine applications and an ever-expanding line of high-quality wiring components and solutions to fit your needs. Next, we're going to talk about soldering. So we talked about crimp connections. Let's talk about soldering. Soldering seems simple enough, doesn't it? You strip, you twist, you heat, you melt, you repeat. Well, it's really not as simple as it may sound. From my experience over the years, finding properly executed non-factory solder connections in automotive wiring is a lot like buying a lottery ticket. Sometimes you get lucky, but unfortunately most of the time you don't. It starts with clean, oil-free, non-corroded materials and a soldering iron that's set to the proper temperature with the proper tip for the materials and connector being soldered. I prefer solder with about a 30 thousandths diameter, that's a 60-40 rosin core, 60% being tin and the 40 referring to the lead content. I prefer it due to its low melting point. What you don't want to do is use one of these when you're soldering your wires. Now there is a time and a place for this. If you're soldering a large gauge battery cable end, for example, you would generally at times end up utilizing a torch if you're going to do that. You want to make sure that you do have that right solder. You never want to use a acid core solder with electrical wiring, and you don't want to use a very large diameter, large gauge solder versus the 30 thousandths because you'll have to apply way too much heat, which is going to cause you to have some issues with a poor connection. So we can show you how to properly solder a joint. When I solder connections, in the case of this butt connector, I like to interlace my conductors with each other, kind of fan them out a little bit if you need to. Interlace them through and twist the conductors opposite of each other, which in itself will give you a semi-secure joint, and it also doesn't affect the overall diameter of the wire as much as some other twisting techniques. Over the years, I've found that these little helping hands can actually be quite the helping hand when it comes to soldering your connections, because it allows you to free up your additional hands. You want to make sure that your soldering iron is set to the proper temperature with a clean tip, and again using the proper solder. You want to apply heat to the back side of the conductor. You don't want to apply the heat directly to the solder. It's okay to put a little bit of solder on the tip to help it conduct heat a little faster to your wire, but you actually want to heat the wire and to get it hot enough to where it melts, and it gives you good penetration. By putting the heat on the back side of the conductor and the solder opposite, it will actually pull the solder towards the heat, which will allow it to flow completely through the joint, giving you a nice solid connection. You want to avoid applying too much heat and too much solder, as it can cause some other issues that is associated with the joint. As I'd mentioned, you never want to touch the solder to the iron in order to start the flow into the joint. Doing so will result in a cold solder joint that is porous, can be brittle, and prone to resistance. A properly soldered joint should be smooth and shiny. It should never be dull. If it's dull or it looks like solder is just globbed on, it's probably a cold joint. On a short side note, if you use lead-free solder, it's generally going to look duller than a lead-based solder is going to look. The most common mistake that we see in the field is wicking, and that's actually when there's too much heat and too much solder that's physically applied to the joint, and it causes it to wick underneath the insulation. We look at our nice flexible multi-strand wire out here. We've seen that it's quite flexible. You can take quite a bit of movement. We go to this particular joint. I intentionally wick this joint, and if we apply some pressure to the outside edge of the conductor, we can actually see where it's become rigid out underneath the insulation. What happens with too much heat and too much solder is actually pulls, or essentially wicks, the solder out into the insulation. And what happens is it takes our joint, and unfortunately, it makes it quite brittle and prone to failure. It's one of the reasons that crimp connectors a lot of times are better, and why I generally go with them. As you saw in the earlier video on crimps, that connection that I crimped took a lot more abuse. I strongly advise against soldering connections on small gauge wire. Generally, if you're in the 20 gauge or smaller, 20, 22, 24, 26 gauge wire, it was always better to crimp that connection. If you're soldering butt splices, it's a good idea to create a strain relief using 2 overlapping layers of adhesive lined shrink tube. When creating a strain relief with shrink tube, you want to use 2 different lengths. That way it overlaps and gives you an additional amount of relief. Go ahead and we're going to shrink the first layer on. Make sure it's centered up, and I like to use adhesive lined shrink to give me a good tight seal. We'll go ahead and we'll put our secondary layer on. Again, make sure that you overlap the ends of the first layer. Applying the overlapping edges gives you a nice strain relief, especially once this cools down a little bit. It'll allow it to be resistant to damage to that solder joint due to flexing. Most of the time I crimp, but depending on the application, I will solder or crimp and solder the connection. The cost of crimping tools can be high, and if you're going to perform quality crimps, they really are required investment and well worth the cost. Maybe you're lucky and you have a buddy that owns them and he's kind enough to let you use those and borrow them from time to time. If you don't have access to the proper crimping tools for your connection, but that connection can be soldered, by all means properly solder and shrink those connections. Whatever method you choose, just remember a couple simple things, and that's to do it properly. Leave your wire nuts in your house, your T-taps in the trash can, and the twist and tape methods to your competition. For more recommendations and tips on wiring your vehicle, check out our other great Holley Tech videos.